are going to go over the female reproductive system. Excuse me. I have had a lot of coffee today, so that's just a little bit of a forewarning. So I might talk a little quickly, but luckily this is a recording, so you can pause it. There'll also be closed captioning for your viewing pleasure. So, some important things to think about physiologically. We'll talk about the different cycles. There is an ovarian cycle, there's an endometrial cycle, and they involve different cell types. And there's a nice little story that goes along with each one to help you put the sequence of events in order and then understand how these things happen, why they happen, and what triggers them to happen. It's a very complicated cycle that happens in individuals that are not on hormonal contraceptives, which, just for your own knowledge, if you're interested, about 93% at the last investigation of females of childbearing age, they are on some sort of hormonal contraceptive. So this would be the cycle that we would see when there's no intervention with taken or supplemented hormones. So then we'll tie together the pieces of everything into the full reproductive tract and talk about the functions of fertility in the female. So in the male system, the gametes that we were talking about were sperm. And so in females, the oocyte, or the egg cell, is going to be the main cell type that the body is going to put all of its energy in to creating. And so there's a lot of different events, there's a lot of different hormones, and you'll have to keep them all straight, but I'll do my best to guide you through it. Female humans are on a menstrual cycle, which typically is 28 to 35 days. That would be considered a normal length menstrual cycle. Anything that's shorter or longer than that would be considered dysmenorrhea. Dys means bad or deranged. Also, bleeding during that time would be considered abnormal bleeding or dysmenorrhea. So the endometrial cycle, the ovarian cycle, these things are going to function together as a result of these endocrine hormones. So we'll start out with just our sagittal section here, where we start just looking at the accessory and then the main organs of female reproduction. So again, if we think about this as purely physiological for the creation of an egg, that is going to happen within the ovary. There are two ovaries. You can only see one in this picture. There are typically two, so there'd be one over here. And we'll see that the ovaries, they do take turns in ovulation, so that one would release an egg 1 month, giving time for the follicles which contain the eggs to mature in the other ovary, so that would be released in the next menstrual cycle. Another thing that's associated with the ovary is the fallopian or uterine tube. One thing that I want you to keep in mind, and I'll show you a video of this, is that the fallopian tubes, even though in this picture it looks like they're physically on top of or attached to the ovaries, they're really not. And you'll see that from a more straightforward section, where if we look at, that looks really good, this would be the fallopian tube up here, and then the ovaries come off down here. So there really is not a direct anatomical connection. So during ovulation, the fallopian tubes are actually attracted to the ovary that is ovulated and has to catch then the egg that is ovulated. So we'll focus a lot of our attention up here, but we'll also focus a lot of our attention down in the uterus. And the uterus is made out of a lining, the endometrial lining of the cavity, and then a lot of it is just muscle. We call that the myometrium. And the uterus's job is multifaceted. It would be to allow an egg to implant in it, so it can house things there. And where I drew that egg is important. When an egg actually burrows into the wall, it's not just on the outside, it physically burrows in. So it has to house an egg, and then in the first 10 weeks, we refer to that structure growing as an embryo, and after 10 weeks it takes on the name of a fetus. So that's pretty much what we call the first trimester, and when the embryonic stage is around or happening, that's when all of the organs and systems are developing. After the organism becomes a fetus, everything should be developed, generally, the general structures. So at that point, it's just going to start growing and getting larger. So the uterus does have rugae in it in the same way that the stomach and the bladder have rugae, which allow it to stretch without changing the pressure inside. So if you think of even a triplet pregnancy, this can stretch quite a bit. So it has that ability because of the rugae. And the uterus is connected then to the vaginal canal. So the vaginal canal will function to do things like allow insemination and also allow delivery if there's a fertilized egg in there that develops, which the chances are, just for those who really love odds, the chances of a fertilized egg implanting every month are about 1 out of 3, so 33%. So if the egg isn't fertilized, or there wasn't an egg that was released in an anovulatory cycle, the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, will slough off in menses. So it will allow the passage of menses. And it also is a copulatory organ too, meaning that when there is intercourse, it will use for insemination for egg purposes, the vaginal canal. Different than what we see in the male physiology, the bladder and urethra are not associated with the same lumen that the gametes are going to use. So the bladder and then the urethra, they are separate. There is a separate opening up here, and then there's the vaginal opening down here. All right, this here is the pubic bone. So there is not a lot of anchoring here in the wall. As we talked about with males, there's not a really strong anchoring of any of these things to the body, especially the ovaries, which means they have the ability to turn and twist on themselves, which you see when they're really heavy. So that would be more common with a cyst there. That is something that needs to be corrected immediately. One good thing about that is when it does twist, it causes such intense pain that typically you'll see females, they pass out and they usually vomit. And usually the vomiting and the physical act of syncope or losing consciousness is enough triggering of activity, especially vomiting. You get the contraction of these abdominal muscles. That's actually enough force a lot of the time to untwist the ovary. So the intense pain causing vomiting can actually fix the torsion. Okay, so the ovaries, the tubes, the uterus with endometrium, and then the vaginal canal, and then the external genitalia is mainly accessory, and we'll talk about that at the very end. So here we're just looking at the internal structures with inside the lower abdomen. And for those of you who have taken gross, you probably got a look at this. And the size of a normal, typical, not ovary, but a uterus is really not much bigger than a fist. So it's about the size of a human fist, and it sits very low in the abdomen below the umbilicus. And it is anchored in a couple of different ways, but still has a large ability to move around, especially specific structures. So the ovaries have a huge ability to move around because there's really only a couple suspensory ligaments that hold things like the fallopian tubes. What you mainly see is this broad ligament. We'll see an actual picture of this in a little bit. So this broad ligament is something that would actually attach like to the below the hip bone region, like the ischial region, to help kind of paste, using this ligament, everything against the wall or the cavity. So that's called the broad ligament because it's very, very big. And in pregnancy, there's something called broad ligament pain, which females get because the uterus starts to grow and then it tugs on this broad ligament, which maintains its attachment to the hip area, and then the uterus continues to grow and stretch. So that does cause pretty intense pain when it grows. Okay, so some other things that we mentioned, we have our uterine cavity. The innermost part there is the endo, or within inner metrium, endometrial lining. Then there's the myo or muscular portion, the myometrium. There is another ligament here, the uterosacral ligament, to help anchor this towards the wall, so there's not that much free movement of the uterus itself. We talked about the vaginal canal. The vagina also has rugae associated with it. So during sexual excitation, there's, in the same way in males, there's a rush of blood flow to the genitals that happens in females as well. So blood flow is increased to the genitals, the vaginal area, and it actually allows the lengthening of the vaginal canal. So in times of non-excitement, the vaginal canal is relatively short, but during sexual excitement, it can become a couple more inches long, 6 to 8 inches long. Fun facts. So there is rugae there. One thing we didn't mention is the doorway to the uterus, or the cervix. And the cervix, if you take your finger and just touch the tip of your nose, that should be what a normal, healthy cervix feels like. There shouldn't be any bumps on it. There shouldn't be any ridges, any rough pieces. It should just have a little bit of soft cartilage mass to it. During pregnancy, the cervix's job is to support the weight of a growing fetus. When you talk about a woman dilating, that is referring to the fetus, the cervix. The cervix has to dilate, and it has to dilate to 10 inches before it's recommended that women start to push. If it's not 10 inches, it's not enough of a pathway for the fetal head to get through, making it more likely that there will be tearing associated with that. So it does have to dilate to 10 inches. Okay, so this is a term we see a lot, the isthmus. We saw this term in the thyroid, and we said the isthmus was this connecting stalk. So the connector right here, this connecting stalk of the fallopian tube, essentially, to the uterus, is called the isthmus. And then we have this nice long fallopian tube, and when you look at the lumen, it's really, really tiny. And it shouldn't be bigger than this because it's really only meant to allow the passage of sperm, there's a little sperm, or of an egg cell. Which means if there's anything that causes narrowing of that, either on purpose or because of inflammatory issues, there's not going to be a transit of sperm or egg. In that case, you can see the egg developing elsewhere, which you may have heard of. It's called an ectopic pregnancy. Because typically, when I say typically a lot, I've just figured out today, when an egg is fertilized, it's way up here in the ampulla region of the fallopian tube. So it has to go all the way down to the uterus, which is a journey that takes about 10 days in most cases. So it doesn't just fall down there. There's peristaltic contractions that would move the egg down. When people get their tubes tied, that doesn't mean that they physically tie their fallopian tubes together in a knot. It means that some suture is wrapped around this tube and then tied as tight as possible. This is another thing, just like we talked about how vasectomies can fail. If it's not a total occlusion of that tube, there can still be a small amount of room that sperm can get through. If sperm can get through and then not the egg, then the egg will continue to develop here, and that is an ectopic pregnancy. It cannot survive there in the fallopian tube. However, if it is big enough to allow the passage of an egg and a sperm, then the fertilized egg can make it down to the uterus, and surprise, the tube tying procedure didn't work. Okay, stromal cells, we've probably mentioned the word stroma. Those are functional cells, or also cells that give some structure to that area. There's a lot of mucosal cells here in the uterus and the entire vaginal canal, so this is something that is lubricated inside and out. There are finger-like projections on the fallopian tubes called the fimbriae. There's blood vessels associated with the ovaries so that they can receive products from the pituitary and also release their own products. I've mentioned these terms before. Corpus means body, and luteum comes from the word luteal, or to luteinize. It means to make yellow. So we'll see that just like testes, the ovaries are technically endocrine and exocrine. So when the follicles are developing, they do things like make estrogen. And then once they pop out, there's some tissue left over, which is yellow, and it's called the corpus luteum. And that makes progesterone. But how does the egg get out? It doesn't just, go through a duct. That would be nice if it just went right down here and went into the uterus. That would be really pleasant. Instead, what happens is that unlike the male body where sperm can just leave through the testes and epididymis, the mature egg in ovulation actually has to break down this wall and then it bursts out in a really fun thing called ovulation. And we'll talk about that. So there's a lot of different pieces in there and they're all doing something different and then they're hopefully working together at the same time. So the ovary is the main, again, when we think about the female reproductive tract functioning to make more people so that we get the survival of a species, it would need to work with procreation, so growing eggs. And the main organ then of the female reproductive tract, the gamete here, would be the ovary. And there are two ovaries again. They are not directly attached to the fallopian tube. They sit right beneath it, and they just have this little stalk that attaches them to the uterus. They lie in a part of the body called the peritoneal fold. And what that means is in gross anatomy, you might have done this. So when you take off the abdomen, so if you took off the rib cage, I know you did that already. But when you take off the abdomen, so if this was like the umbilicus, the belly button, and then you turn it around, so now you're looking at the inner part of the abdomen and not the outside skin, there's a couple different folds that are here. So the fold that's associated with the ovary is called the peritoneal fold. So that's where you'll find it, in one of those folds. Peritoneal fold is where it is. And it's held by this broad ligament, as we mentioned, which is close to the lateral or side wall of the pelvic cavity. So it really attaches right above these ischium processes, these hip bones. When we look at the histology of the ovary, there's a couple pieces that we see that are common in all tissues. We have the cortex region, the cortical region. Remember that cortex is Latin for bark. So like bark covers a tree, the cortical region covers an organ. On the inside is the medullary region, the medulla. So the cortex is going to include the cellular stroma, so the functional cells, and also the structural cells. And that is where we're going to see follicles. And wherever you see F, that's a follicle. And a follicle, that would be like describing your house. Like an egg lives in a follicle. Everything it needs to eat and live is in there. And eventually the follicle bursts and just the egg leaves. So a follicle is not referring to an egg is in a follicle. So I wouldn't call you your house, I would say you live in a house. So eggs live in a follicle. So follicles are these things that are going to pop up when there is an endocrine message to do so, and they mature, and there's a couple of them that develop at a time, and the one that wins, the one that gets the biggest, will be ovulated. All right, so this ovary is covered by a capsule, so a fibrous capsule. The tunica albuginea and ovarian surface epithelial cells make up this cortical region. Again, this is not a system like the male system where there is a duct. In order for the gametes to leave the ovary once they have matured, they need to engage in an inflammatory reaction to break down the wall that is limiting their ability to travel, and then they will burst out at a pretty high velocity. We'll see a video of that. All right, this is my favorite slide. Before I do anything else, I am going to tell you that this is the most important slide of the female reproductive chapter. Everything you should know endocrine cycle-wise is on here. So the menstrual cycle is referring to, again, this 28 to 35 day, 28 to 35 normal menstrual cycle, whereby there is the development of follicles, the release of an egg, and then the leftover pieces doing their own thing. Whoops. So what I'll start with is just talking you through each of these little panels so that you know what's going on in each one. So I'll start at the top because that's the first thing we're talking about with regards to the menstrual cycle. And as I said, there's a couple of different cycles. So first off, we've got the ovarian cycle, which just means this is what's going on in the ovaries during the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle begins at day 0, and that is when menses occurs. That's what people call their period. My hippie friends call it their moon. And that is because this giant space rock in the sky controls when this happens. So super fun. When you think about horoscopes as a female, it doesn't seem that bizarre that stars would influence things because your body is controlled by the moon, a giant space rock going around the earth. But I digress. So when menses occurs, that's when the wall starts to slough off. So that's the beginning of, the period. So that's the beginning of all these cycles, like the first day of the period or menses. And during this phase, we call it the follicular phase because this phase is predominated by the need to grow a follicle so that we have some mature eggs. There's not just one follicle, it's actually dependent on age. The younger people are, the more follicles they mature every month. So the follicles, they start to grow and grow and grow, and whatever follicle has gotten the biggest will be ovulated. In this picture, they made menses 28 days, which is fine, but just know that not everybody has the same cycle. The moon is weird. So what they did is just divide this in half. So they're saying that 28 days is a full cycle. So clearly halfway in between should be when there's ovulation. So the follicle gets big and then the dominant follicle is ovulated. So see here, this is the follicle. And then here is just the oocyte or egg cell. So the egg will go out and do what it needs to do. It'll try to make its way through the fallopian tube to the uterus and perhaps be fertilized or not be fertilized and be sloughed away in the next menstrual cycle. So this egg has to burst out of this tissue. It breaks down that stroma, it leaves, and just like you would, it sounds gross, but like pop a pimple. You squeeze it so the oil, the sebum comes out, and now there's leftover tissue. And in your face, that turns red and gets irritated, and you're not supposed to touch it. In the ovary, when the egg bursts out, that leftover healing tissue is yellow, and that's where that name luteum comes from. It's yellow, and it's a body, so it's a yellow body. So the corpus luteum is this healing tissue left over from the egg leaving and damaging the tissue, and then it starts to get smaller, so we call that regression. It starts to regress, and then it heals eventually and goes away and no longer does anything. And then we call it the corpus albicans, when it's really on its way to healing and going away and it's no longer yellow. So it's either yellow or it's not. Okay, so follicles grow, one is ovulated. For simplicity's sake, it would be halfway between the start and end of menses, and then the corpus luteum is left over. All right, how can you tell somebody has ovulated or if they're going to ovulate? Fun things, the body temperature in females, so the basal or baseline body temperature. So that would be the temperature your body is before you engage in any activity that day. So even getting out of bed. If you put a thermometer in the mouth of yourself or a patient before you get out of bed and you've not generated any metabolic energy, that would be your normal body temperature, your basal body temperature. And 37 degrees Celsius is usually what we consider normal. It's like your 98.6 in Fahrenheit. So what this is illustrating is that during this follicular phase, before ovulation, the basal body temperature is lower. And then right before ovulation, it's called peri-ovulation or pre-ovulation, the body temperature starts to go up. You can confirm that ovulation has occurred because the body temperature, the basal body temperature, should go up by 1 degree, and then it stays elevated pretty much to the end of the menstrual cycle. So it starts to go down right before the menstrual cycle ends. So when people are seeking reproductive help or they just want to monitor their own fertility, body temperature testing is a really straightforward, easy way to do that. And it's usually the first step that fertility physicians or OBGYN specialists give to a patient to see if they're ovulating before doing something more invasive. All right, so before I go to the next slide, I'm going to show you, first of all, what these things are making. So egg cells, which are in follicles, as they get bigger, and their job is to make estrogen. The bigger they are, the more estrogen they make. So we would say that the follicular phase, so it's predominated by the growing follicles, we would say the predominant hormone during the follicular phase is estradiol, which is the main circulating form of estrogen. So these make estradiol, and it's the bigger they get, the more they make. And then you'll notice at ovulation, the estrogen goes way down. And we'll see why that is in just a second. Then, after the egg has left, well, yeah, now it's ovulated. What's there to make more estrogen? Well, nothing. So instead, we are going to have the corpus luteum, the leftover tissue on the ovary. It has its own job, and it's to make progesterone. That's here in purple. So we would say the luteal phase, so that's the part of the phase where the corpus luteum is now in charge, that is predominated by progesterone. So the corpus luteum makes progesterone and the egg cells make estradiol. Progesterone is important because that's your shutoff. That's your negative feedback. As long as there's progesterone around, then there's not going to be another menstrual cycle that started. So I'll get to this in a little bit, but progesterone is really important. So you'll see that progesterone goes up throughout this luteal phase, and then it drops when it's time for menstruation. So as I said, there's two ovaries, so this is just happening on one side, right? So that egg is gone. Well, now the other ovary is going to start developing its follicles. So do you see how estrogen starts to go up again in the second phase? Well, that's because those follicles are now growing and making their own estrogen. But keep in mind, for menstruation and for ovulation, levels of estrogen and progesterone have to be really, really, really low. So there's these large fluctuations in hormones. That's essentially the way that birth control works. It gives women a standard set dose of estrogen/progesterone so that you never have these dips that are needed for ovulation or for menses. However, most oral medications have placebo pills in them, which allow the body to then menstruate because you're not supplying hormones during that time. Magic, right? Nope, just pharmacology. Okay, so why do those things happen? Why does the egg get released? Why does the corpus luteum form? Why do these follicles start to grow? Well, that's because of anterior pituitary hormones. During the follicular phase, the things that are made by the pituitary, luteinizing hormone, which is named for what it does, and follicle stimulating hormone, they're not very high. But when the egg gets really, really big, when all of these follicles are getting big, when the dominant follicle, it's kind of like the ultimate warrior thing, like it is the dominant one, it is the champion, and it celebrates by letting out this huge spike of estrogen to let everybody know that it's the dominant one and it wins and it's going to go to the uterus and leave the ovary. It's really happy. So what you see is that follicle stimulating hormone, that is, it's not high, but it is the predominant pituitary hormone because it's just being released to help these follicles start to grow, start to get bigger. But there's a little spike in ovulation, and that's caused by this spike in estrogen because that feeds back, remember, to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus so that the body is like, wow, we should do something. So FSH is going to be released, and then it goes back down to like pretty much nothing because during the luteal phase, there's not much to do. We don't want to drive follicles to start maturing. The luteinizing hormone, the yellow hormone, the one that makes things yellow, LH, that is the one associated with ovulation. Ovulation. So same thing, when this dominant follicle gets really, really big and makes a ton of estrogen, that will cause the pituitary to release a huge spike of luteinizing hormone. That LH will drive this process of ovulation. Then LH can go down. It's only really high for about 36 hours, sometimes 48 hours. So that's called the fertile window. That's it. That's all. Those are all the hours in a month a woman can get pregnant. Isn't that crazy? 36 to 48 hours. You have this LH spike. And then it goes back down to nothing because we don't want to have any type of ovulation. We already did that and now we're done. So the hormone that drives that ovulation, which is triggered by estrogen release or an estrogen spike, is LH. As I said before, when people are tracking their fertility or whatever, if they're tracking their own fertility, you can do this daily basal body temperature check. Another thing that there is are ovulation testers. So ovulation sticks. So in the same way that people urinate, sticks with an X, on a pregnancy test, they're looking for a hormone called human chorionic growth hormone. Ovulation tests, they test for luteinizing hormone. So if people were trying not to get pregnant, if they had a positive ovulation test for LH, then they should avoid intercourse. If they're trying to get pregnant, that means that they're now in their fertile window. All right. So that's LH and FSH. So follicle stimulating is named because it stimulates follicles to start maturing, start growing, and luteinizing hormone is named that because it drives ovulation and then the creation of this yellow body, this corpus luteum, to make progesterone. Woo, how fun. So we've got follicular phase, luteal phase. The final thing is the uterine cycle. It has some different names that we'll see in a little bit. But you'll see at the beginning of menses, the wall sloughs off. Anytime estrogen is low, the wall will slough. That's important for patho. And then what happens is during the follicular phase, the uterine lining starts to grow. So we have these small little arterioles here, and they're going to start branching and branching and then become spiraled. And then during this luteal phase, when it would be possible for implantation to occur, the uterine lining gets very thick. So the endometrium goes through hyperplasia. There's lots and lots of cells. If there is an egg, if the chances of 1 out of 3 worked out, the egg, the fertilized egg, would burrow in and then start growing here. And then the placenta would develop around it. So this is physically inside of the endometrium. It's not out here. An egg doesn't implant on top. If the egg is not fertilized, it would not burrow in here. It can't. It just goes out with the menses, and then the wall is sloughed off. Okay, if the egg is fertilized, but it fails to implant, it gets sloughed off or sloughed out as well. If there is no hyperplasia of the wall, a fertilized egg cannot implant. So you probably, unless you've been living without a television or newspaper, have heard of a drug called Plan B, which is sold in drugstores and everywhere now without a prescription. What Plan B does is give a really high dose. It's essentially like birth control on steroids. It's a high dose of estrogen, a high dose of progesterone, which arrests this cycle. So if ovulation happened here, right? So if there was a chance that an egg was fertilized, Plan B works best when taken within 72 hours of unplanned or unintended intercourse, or just intercourse that was not desired to result in fertilization of an egg. It gives this big dose because, as you can see, you need progesterone to grow this wall. So Plan B, what it does is it arrests wall growth. So even if there was a fertilized egg, it has nowhere to go. So it would just be removed with the menstrual cycle. So that's how that works. It's kind of like if you have a guest bed and you put on all these nice comforters for people, they're more likely to stay there. If you stripped up all the sheets and only have a bare mattress on the floor, they're probably not going to stay very long. So that's the way Plan B works. It is not the abortion pill. There is an abortion pill we talk about in Patho. It's called RU486, and that does not do this. So there you go. That's the whole menstrual cycle. But now let's back up and just talk about the ovaries. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is dependent upon the maturing of follicles. So you'll also hear it called the follicular cycle because the follicles will go through these phases of getting big and then being ovulated and then regressing. And this is happening constantly. And when this is happening, when ovulation happens in one ovary, the other one is essentially gearing up for this. So the follicular cycle is going to start in the same way as males with these germ cells, these little stem cells, which are going to start to mature into mature follicle cells that become bigger and thicker and more complicated. There is the process of ovulation in the middle, and then there's the leftover tissue, which will make progesterone called the corpus luteum. So that continues to make progesterone until it regresses and then goes back into corpus albicans. And then we're back at the beginning with these primordial stem cell follicles. So it's kind of like a rotating thing. So one thing happens and then the process starts over again. All right, so the earliest structure are primordial. We've used this term already in the male reproductive chapter. So primordial, the earliest form of life. The primordial follicle, there's not a ton associated with it. There is an egg cell inside of it. There are pregranulosa cells. There's a basal layer. So there's not a ton going on. It's just very simple egg cell with a nucleolus and not a ton of structure to it. These appear during mid-gestation. So that means when a female is in utero, they create through just the stem cell differentiation process primordial follicles that are housed within the ovaries, and they stay there as primordial follicles until they receive a message to start differentiating from follicle stimulating hormone. There are about 7 million of these primary oocytes in females. Some of them go away through a process called atresia, and some of them are ovulated. Just like in male spermatogenic tissue, these follicular cells, they develop right next to each other, and they do have gap junctions between them so that they can share their nutrients and share things that you need to live. All right, so this is written out on the next slide, but essentially what this process is this egg cell becoming more and more supported. So it's going to take on more structures. It's going to take on more thicker cells associated with it. They're going to become more stratified or layered. They have a thecal layer, which helps protect them. And they have the fun little zona pellucida that we'll see is very important because that's what sperm has to make it through after ovulation. All right, so the ovarian reserve, again, about 7 million follicles are around in initial development. By the time people get to reproductive maturity, which is in females, that's the age of the onset of menses. And it's finally over when, or not over, but it's completed. Reproductive maturity, it has been achieved when puberty is over, which for females is pretty young. It's between like 12 and 14, sometimes 16s, very rarely 17 or 18. So that's not always the best time to start a family, but that's usually when there's the most follicles, about 300,000. Then it's not a magic age. The older people get, the less follicles there will be that start developing together at the beginning of every follicular cycle. So between the onset of menses, which is called menarche, women ovulate about 450 follicles with eggs inside of them. Menopause literally means the pausing of menses. So menses just stops. There's less than 100 left. The age of menopause, if you want to predict it for your patients or for yourself or whoever you're interested in, you usually ask their mother and their grandmother what age they went through menopause at, because there's a really strong genetic link to the age of menopause. It's pretty standard throughout families. There's also environmental factors that involve medications that are taken, surgeries that are done, hysterectomies. So all of those things are involved, but the biggest predictor is really just genetics of first order relatives. So this is just showing you the reserve that's left over, how many grow, how many are ovulated, about 450. And sometimes they just go away, and that process is called atresia. So when they're around for too long or there's something less than ideal about them, they just die. We don't need the energy to go into keeping them alive. So atresia is just a normal process of things not needed dying off. So controlled apoptosis is what we call it. You can say apoptosis if you want. It's up to you. All right. At that reproductive maturity I mentioned, so when females are at their prime age, so 16, 14, that's when females have the most success with becoming pregnant really easily. And that's because about 20 mature together every month. So about 20 follicles, when FSH is released, they start growing and maturing. The one that gets the biggest, that's the only one that's ovulated. So the rest, they just die through this atresia process. So they just didn't make it. Okay, and as I mentioned, as these primordial follicles start to get bigger and bigger, they really just take on more structure. So they develop a cavity around them so that nutrients can be there. There's granulosa cuboidal cells. These granulosa cells, they just spread and grow, they proliferate. And eventually we have a secondary follicle. So that's 3 to 6 more layers of cells. And then these stromal cells, they turn into tough thecal cells, which really help protect this egg. Eventually you'll see a mature preantral follicle, which makes this zona pellucida, which we'll see in just a little bit. That's where sperm binds. Without the zona pellucida, sperm can't get into an egg. So it is the place where receptors for sperm are located. Also on preantral follicles, they have FSH receptors. So when follicle stimulating hormone is released by the pituitary, it binds to receptors on the follicles and drives their growth. That's what follicle stimulating hormone does. All right, so again, depend on FSH for growth. Early antral follicles, about 25 days it takes to go to preantral to these early ones. Tons of growth, more fluid, more granulosa cells. These are also steroidogenic, which means it can make steroid hormones, mainly the estradiol. They're circulating estrogen, estradiol. And after the mural granulosa cells are busted through by the egg that leaves, those mural granulosa cells will become corpus luteal cells. There's also there's so many fun names in physiology, I promise. Cumulus cells, which means a cloud. Cumulus clouds are like those little wispy, like thin clouds, right? Like, beautiful cumulus clouds. So those are the inner cells that surround the oocyte. So the cumulus cells, cumulus clouds, cumulus cells. So they surround it, and they actually help protect the egg out in the cavity and in the fallopian tube so that it's not immediately just degraded by all the things in the body. All right, so here is a zona pellucida, and that is required for the acrosome reaction. What's that? Hey, remember when I was talking in the male reproductive chapter and I said that sperm has a helmet on it filled with really strong, like lysosome-like enzymes? Well, that's acrosome. So let me just show you a very quick video of a fertilization so that we can get a nice little hand on this. All right.
Single sperm. Fertilization is the epic story of a single sperm facing incredible odds to unite with an egg and form a new human life. It is the story of all of us. During sexual intercourse, about 300 million sperm enter the vagina. Soon afterward, millions of them will either flow out of the vagina die in its acidic environment. However, many survive because of the protective elements provided in the fluid surrounding them. Next, the sperm must pass through the cervix, an opening into the uterus. Usually, it remains tightly closed, but here the cervix is open for a few days while the woman ovulates. The sperm swim through the cervical mucus, which is thinned to a more watery consistency for easier passage. Once inside the cervix, the sperm continues swimming toward the uterus, though millions will die trying to make it through the mucus. Some sperm remain behind, caught in the folds of the cervix, but they may later continue the journey as a backup to the first group. Inside the uterus, muscular uterine contractions assist the sperm on their journey toward the egg. However, resident cells from the woman's immune system, mistaking the sperm for foreign invaders, destroy thousands more. Next, half the sperm head for the empty fallopian tube, while the other half swim toward the tube containing the unfertilized egg. Now, only a few thousand remain. Inside the fallopian tube, tiny cilia push the egg toward the uterus. To continue, the sperm must surge against this motion to reach the egg. Some sperm get trapped in the cilia and die. During this part of the journey, chemicals in the reproductive tract cause the membranes covering the heads of the sperm to change. As a result, the sperm become hyperactive, swimming harder and faster toward their destination. At long last, the sperm reach the egg. Only a few dozen of the original 300 million sperm remain. The egg is covered with a layer of cells called the corona radiata. The sperm must push through this layer to reach the outer layer of the egg, the zona pellucida. When sperm reach the zona pellucida, they attach to specialized sperm receptors on the surface, which triggers their acrosomes to release digestive enzymes, enabling the sperm to burrow into the layer. Inside the zona pellucida is a narrow, fluid-filled space just outside the egg cell membrane. The first sperm to make contact will fertilize the egg. After a perilous journey and against incredible odds, a single sperm attaches to the egg cell membrane. Within a few minutes, their outer membranes fuse and the egg pulls the sperm inside. This event causes changes in the egg membrane that prevent other sperm from attaching to it. Next, the egg releases chemicals that push other sperm away from the egg and create an impenetrable fertilization membrane. As the reaction spreads outward, the zona pellucida hardens, trapping any sperm unlucky enough to be caught inside. Outside the egg, sperm are no longer able to attach to the zona pellucida. Meanwhile, inside the egg, the tightly packed male genetic material spreads out. A new membrane forms around the genetic material, creating the male pronucleus. Inside, the genetic material reforms into 23 chromosomes. The female genetic material, awakened by the fusion of the sperm with the egg, finishes dividing, resulting in the female pronucleus, which also contains 23 chromosomes. As the male and female pronuclei form, spiderweb-like threads, called microtubules, pull them toward each other. The two sets of chromosomes join together, completing the process of fertilization. At this moment, a unique genetic code arises, instantly determining gender, hair color, eye color, and hundreds of other characteristics. This new single cell, the zygote, is the beginning of a new human being. And now the cilia in the fallopian tube gently sweep the zygote toward the uterus, where he or she will implant in the rich uterine lining, growing and maturing for the next 9 months until ready for birth.
Very cool, right? So as I mentioned before, it is not the fastest sperm to get to the egg that fertilizes it. It's the sperm that takes advantage of the fact that all the other sperm have already made an opening for it. So it's the most opportunistic sperm that gets inside of it. And then once the sperm gets in, there's this huge influx of calcium and it prevents more sperm from getting in. If more than one sperm get in, what do you think would happen? There would be enough DNA, enough genetic material for 1.5 people. Do you think that would survive? Do you? No, it is incompatible with life. That egg would immediately shut down and be eliminated with the menses. All right, so let's look at a real egg that has been unovulated. So here is the secondary oocyte. Here's a little metaphase plate, how cool. Here's the cumulus cells on the outside. Here's the zona pellucida. This is the polar body, so you know which side you're looking at. These are the mural granulosa cells. So look at all of this protection this egg has around it in the follicle. And then you've got the thicker thecal layers that'll eventually become the corpus luteum. So that is what it would look like histologically before ovulation. Lots of cool things. And as I mentioned, whatever one is the biggest. And as we know, the growth is determined by follicle stimulating hormone, and these all have FSH receptors. So whichever one has the most is called the dominant follicle. And this is from a sonogram, and on sonograms, fluid is black. So this is showing you the dominant follicle. You can see other follicles that have started developing, or they're going to go away with atresia. Yeah, they're not going to make it. They're too tiny. So this one, because it has the most receptors, it grew the biggest, so now it wins. This will be the one that will be ovulated. So as I mentioned, about 20 before the age of 33, and no magic age. Sometimes they use the age 35 as like something terrible will happen after that. It's really just with age, the older you get. So if age goes up, then the amount of follicles that are matured each month go down. So this happens until one remains, and this is something that's monitored by people getting fertility treatment. So they go for sonograms to make sure a dominant follicle has been created, and they're pretty big. They're about 1 to 1.5 centimeters. So now that tiny little egg inside of here is going to have to make its way out. As I mentioned, the dominant follicle, and all the follicles really, but they're going to start dying away. The dominant follicle is highly steroidogenic, so it has the ability to make steroid hormones. It not only has an FSH and LH receptor so that it can produce estradiol. There on the other side of the basal layer, the basal lamina, LDL, where I'm looking for it, there we go. There's LDL and HDL, receptor-mediated uptake. And again, I've talked about that a lot. That means that LDL and HDL, they fill up their receptors. Once those receptors are filled up, they form an invagination that snaps shut into a vesicle. It's brought into the cell, and then the free cholesterol is modified through enzymatic reactions into first pregnenolone and then progesterone, then eventually androstenedione. Some testosterone is produced and goes out into the body to do androgen type things in females, like maintaining libido. And then the FSH receptors, LH receptors, those help drive the estradiol production. So in addition, we've got the androstenedione coming over here to help with modification into estrone, which is modified into estradiol, and then testosterone is also modified into estradiol, as we saw in the male physiology. All right, so it's also postulated that not only does the dominant follicle have the most receptors, growing the biggest, but it also inhibits the growth of the other follicles by kind of sucking up all their FSH and then eventually killing them through this atresia-controlled apoptotic process. Okay, as I mentioned, there's not a ton of time that there is the ability for successful fertilization. Periovulation is the time around, peris around ovulation. So as we said, this LH surge, that is going to be triggered by estrogen release, and then eventually the egg and cumulus complex, so the oocyte and the cumulus complex, are released from the ovary. The outer wall of the follicle swells, it protrudes. We'll see a video of this too. And then it's going to swell really big. 30 minutes later, it's going to start to ooze fluid out. The rule in life is that whenever there's fluid in the cavity, it hurts really bad. So this is going to be associated with some lower abdominal pain, which is typical in menstruation too, because fluid gets into the cavity. And then after about 30 minutes of growing, then the stigma will rupture, and then the follicle is going to invaginate, and then eventually it is going to go pop on out. How nice. This periovulatory period is only 32 to 36 hours. That is when you have this high spike of LH. That's really crazy. So that's as long as this will last, and the egg itself doesn't live very long. However, sperm typically lives 3 days, normal sperm, but there are cases, rare cases, where sperm has been able to live 5 days in the uterus. So even when people are paying really good attention to what their temperature is, whether or not there's LH, if they're fertile or not, just keep in mind that 5 days is the maximum that sperm can live. So if intercourse happens 5 days before the egg is released, it is still slightly possible that it will be fertilized. All right, and then once the egg pops out, then the corpus luteum is formed. Progesterone is going to be created by the corpus luteum, and then the growing follicles in the other ovary are going to make their lower amount of estradiol to shut off that process. Okay, so ovulation, we mentioned whenever LH is around, it's going to drive ovulation. So it is going to help release cytokines, so these chemical signals to break down the stigma. This cumulus oocyte complex, it floats out into the antral cavity. Then this basal layer and the thecal layer, they're broken down, and then eventually the egg and the associated cumulus complex around the zona pellucida can be released into the body. So it's a nice long process. I'm going to teach you a really fun word right now. I'm going to try to write it the best I can with this. It's a German word, and it is really fun to say. Mittelschmerz. What a great name. Mittelschmerz is the description in German of the pain associated with ovulation. So it does, it pops out, it hurts really bad. So people paying attention will feel that there's quite a bit of pain, not just with this inflammatory reaction to break down the wall, but all that fluid coming out here, that's going to cause quite a bit of discomfort. So now let's watch a second video about ovulation. No, that's Keyboard Cat. I would like to watch that right now, but let's keep our eyes on the prize.
Ovulation is a part of the menstrual cycle when the ovary releases a ripe egg, or ovum. Inside the ovary are hundreds of thousands of follicles. Each follicle is a hollow ball of cells with an immature egg in the center. The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles begin to grow at the same time. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow and nourishes the developing egg inside it. Around day 12, the follicle secretes a large amount of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland releases a huge surge of luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, causing one of the two fallopian tubes to move in closer and surround the follicle. The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the egg and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the egg. Microscopic cilia on the fimbriae surface transport the egg to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Inside the walls of the fallopian tube, muscular contractions gently push the egg towards the uterus. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12 to 24 hours, so it must be fertilized by a sperm from the male during this time for a woman to become pregnant. If it's not fertilized, the egg dissolves away and is shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation.
How beautiful and magical and painful, right? It's all so interesting. Physiology can be fun, I promise you. So that's your ovulation, and then afterwards, you have the creation of those thecal cells turning into the yellow body, the corpus luteum. So what are you looking at here? All right, this is a real one. It's obviously not yellow in this picture because it has been stained for histology. So in the center, all this is blood. So that's a blood clot. So the clotting coagulation cascade is triggered. So that white stuff, that's fibrin, which you get creation of to hold blood cells together to make a clot. Okay, G is your luteinized granulosa cells. So those cells before were just helping to protect the egg. So now they are going to turn yellow and start making progesterone. S is septa. So just like you have a septum in your nose and septums in your heart and in the testes, there's a septum between each granulosa cell. And T is the luteinized thecal cells. So the granulosa cells and the thecal cells, they will become yellow and they will start to make progesterone. So first you got to heal this up. Well, it's still kind of bleeding and clotted. It's called a corpus hemorrhagicum, a body filled with blood. Technically, anytime blood leaves the circulatory system, it's a hemorrhage. So even if you bleed from a paper cut, that's a hemorrhage. We usually think of it as pretty intense, but that's what it means. So the red blood cells and all the other debris, they have to be removed from the tissue-specific macrophages. So here's one right here. So it's got to come remove the dead cells. The antral cavity is now filled with this matrix type material, and then the granulosa cells get really, really big. They fill with lipid because remember, this is steroidogenic. There's lots of LDL and HDL and steroid hormones in this region. So they become fatty and filled with mass, and lipids are yellow. That's why in like fatty liver disease, the liver turns yellow. So it starts to fill with lipid, and it, in a normal menstrual cycle, would just eventually go away and turn into a corpus albicans and be reabsorbed back into the ovary. So 14 days is the typical lifespan if you're thinking about a 28-day menstrual cycle. However, if there is implantation of an egg, when an egg burrows into the wall and starts growing, immediately it starts making levels of human chorionic growth hormone. Initially, they're very low levels. So even with a blood test, this couldn't be detected for a couple of days, maybe 2 to 3 days after implantation. In order for HCG to become high enough to be detected in a urine test, it takes about another 14 days. That's why it's recommended that females don't take a urine pregnancy test until they've actually missed their period or missed their menses, because the level wouldn't be high enough to be detectable anyways. Other fun fact for those of you who like reproductive stuff, LH and HCG look pretty similar to the body. So if you had leftover ovulation strips that were looking for LH, when HCG is in really large quantities, like 15 days, 20 days later, there would actually be a positive LH or ovulation test because HCG looks so much like luteinizing hormone. Fun times, right? Sure. All right, so this is everything all mapped out for you. So where things are coming from, pituitary-wise, ovary-wise, everything is written out here so you can put it into a nice timeline. Again, we're going from 0 to 28 days, 14 days being ovulation. Obviously, everybody is different. The only ways you can really predict this is by searching for LH in the urine, checking the basal body temperature, and finally, checking the cervical mucus, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so these are the ovarian hormones. We've mentioned these a bunch of times, cholesterol into pregnenolone, then progesterone. We have our DHEA, which is also produced by the adrenals, which can be modified into testosterone, which helps aromatase enzymes convert to estradiol. And then there's also estrone. So when we say the estrogens, we're referring to these estradiol compounds like E2 and E3 that are made in large quantities by the ovaries. This is another schematic showing you the way that these cells work together. We have the granulosa cells, we have the thecal cells, we've got our LDL receptors on there, we've got the granulosa cells modifying cholesterol into progesterone, same thing with the thecal cells. And androgens are created, and with the help of FSH binding, we get the final creation of estrogen. So just like in males, FSH is necessary for sperm, but the testosterone is needed for full functionality of those Sertoli cells. So estrogen and progesterone are controlled by LH and FSH. So just know LH and FSH are both needed in order to get full expression of estrogen. So you have to have active pituitary function in order for steroidogenesis to occur. Woo! So that was all the ovaries. So please know when I ask like which hormone is predominant during the follicular versus luteal phase, and where they're coming from. So estradiol is coming from the follicle and progesterone is coming from the corpus luteum. Okay, what does estrogen do? It has different actions in each tissue. Estrogen is high during puberty. It's also high during fetal development to drive secondary sex characteristics if everything goes perfectly. Estrogen stimulates breast tissue growth. It stimulates uterus maturation. It helps during pregnancy. Estrogen is very high during pregnancy because the fetus needs the nourishment accompanied with the correct uterine environment. It maintains body temperature, which is why when people go through menopause, they have heat flashes, hot flashes, and then they start shaking and sweating. So it is needed for body temperature homeostasis. It helps delay memory loss, which is why in association with bone density, the more estrogen there is, the stronger the bones, they would give estrogen replacement therapy to women after menopause to help with staving off dementia and osteoporosis. But just know that estrogen, because it causes breast tissue growth and differentiation, especially around the duct region of the nipple, it is definitely breast cancer dependent. The more estrogen there is, the more breast differentiation and growth. Same thing with the uterus. The more estrogen there is, the more endometrial hypertrophy and hyperplasia. It helps regulate cholesterol because, as you saw, we need cholesterol from the bloodstream to be made into estrogen. So if you're not utilizing that LDL anymore, then it's going to precipitate in the tissues and in the bloodstream. And then your body doesn't just get rid of it, it saves it. And it saves it in pieces of your arteries. It stimulates the ovaries. We already saw that. Menstrual cycle initiation is associated with a high dose of estrogen. It stimulates maturation of the vaginal canal, secondary sex characteristics like the labia, and it also is important in the lubrication properties with the cervix and also the opening of the vaginal orifice. All right, so estrogen and progesterone, they are typical Sex hormones, steroid hormones, they bind on, again, that sex hormone binding globulin. We saw it with testosterone. About 60% of it is bound to that. 20% is bound to the typical protein albumin in the bloodstream. And that means estrogen can have long range, long-term actions because it can bind to those and hang on really tightly. 20% is free, so there can be immediate effects of it, which is why you see in things like menopause these hot flashes. This free estrogen can go do things really quickly. We've also talked about this protein before, transcortin, which helps bring cortisol around. So cortisol binding globulin or transcortin. Progesterone can bind to that. It has a low affinity for other proteins besides transcortin and albumin, and progesterone only lasts about 5 minutes. That's something really important about progesterone. When people are on progesterone-only birth controls, it doesn't last as long as other types of medications. Sometimes they're called mini pills, and they are safe because estrogen makes blood more coagulable. So if people have high hypertension or they're smoking, which causes blood vessels to constrict, it's not recommended that they take an estrogen-containing medication. So they could be told to take a mini pill or a progesterone-only type of thing. So that would include like the Depo-Provera shot, the implant called the Nexplanon. But when you're taking a pill, so this is important, the half-life of these mini pills, or if we think about its total activity, when somebody takes a progesterone-only pill, it works for 22 hours. You might know that there's 24 hours in the day. That means people have to take it at the same time every day. If typically people take it at 6 a.m., and then they forgot to take it at 6 and don't take it till 10 p.m. the next day, well, look at this. That's a big old window now where that medication is not on board and not active. It's also recommended that people pick times to take it where intercourse is unlikely to occur. So if you're taking it at 6 a.m., 8 a.m. should be the earliest you have intercourse, if you don't want to get pregnant. Okay. As we said, ovaries are the main site of estrogen production. The aromatase enzyme works on androgens so that we can have the creation of estradiol. After menopause, we'll talk about that in a little bit. The ovaries don't make estrogen anymore. They eventually start to fail and estrogen levels go down. So you can supplement that estrogen if there's a low stroke risk, and a low breast cancer risk, but it's not as popular as it once was. All right, whew, that was a ton of ovary stuff. So now let's get down to the oviduct, the other pieces associated with the ovary. So this is going to involve the endometrium, the external genitalia, the cervix. I've mentioned this in the male lecture, the mons pubis, so that's the outside, that's what you can see when people are standing. Try to teach my kids that, like people call that like the vagina, like if those are legs over here. This is the mons pubis. That's not the vagina. The vaginal canal is internal. And then there is the labia majora and labia minora. Those are things that differentiate during puberty. That's dependent on estrogen. The labia majora in females is the analogous tissue to the scrotum in males. So scrotum. And the clitoris is the redundant tissue as the male penis. Here's the urethral opening, and then the vaginal vault, the vaginal opening. And then internally, there is the rugated vaginal canal, the cervix made of cartilage, and then we're in the uterus. The top of an organ that is furthest away from the opening is called the fundus. So the fundus height should be standard unless there's pregnancy, and then the fundus height is something that is measured every month to be sure that the pregnancy is progressing normally. So there's internal and external genitalia. All right, as we saw in that video, it's important for the fallopian tubes to have the ability to move their little fingers or fimbriae so that the egg can be caught by the ovary that would be releasing it way down here. So the fimbriae are the finger-like projections. We have the infundibular portion, and you've heard that term, infundibulum, when we talked about the hypothalamus to pituitary. Do you remember that? The infundibulum was like the connecting stalk. There's larger connecting stalks too called isthmus portions. This is the isthmic portion. So the fimbriae are fingers. So there's a lot of cilia there. The infundibulum, there's a lot of cilia in this area. So the egg would have to travel all the way up through here, eventually get to the ampulla juncture, the ampullary juncture. If there is fertilization, it almost always is up in this ampullary area just because of the rate of transit. It takes about 6 to 10 days for the egg to get all the way down here. So when the egg is released, the sperm would have to make it all the way up here, and it would usually meet the egg here. Okay. And then there's, again, the isthmus, and then interstitial means the innermost portion, the interstitium, the non-functional but innermost tissue. So it functions to move, to catch that egg and move it to the ampullary isthmic junction so that there can be fertilization and then hopefully deliver it to the uterus. It can store sperm. Remember, 5 days is the maximum. So that is possible. There's cases of women ovulating 5 days after intercourse, and the sperm is still in the uterus, getting fed and living. And it's also going to secrete nutritional support for the embryo. It is divided into those 4 sections. That's what they are. One other thing, just real life reasons, or real life stuff, because the fallopian tubes are open to the cavity, fluid can move out of them in lots of cases. So there's something called retrograde menstruation. And if everything was working properly, it would mean my uteruses are getting worse and worse looking the longer I talk for. Okay, so if everything went well, all the menstrual fluid would come down the cervix, out the vaginal canal, and that would be it. That would be nice. However, there is, in everybody with a menstrual cycle, usually every month, a little bit of retrograde menstruation, whereby the menstrual fluid goes up around the tubes and then can come out the open fallopian tubes and then enter the cavity. So you guys know I teach yoga. And in yoga classes, they'll say things like, don't do a headstand if you're menstruating. You're like, I don't want everyone to know I'm menstruating. I'm going to do a headstand. The reason they tell you that is when you're upside down, it's even more likely that fluid move out the fallopian tubes and into the cavity. And as you know, the rule is the more fluid there is in the cavity, the more pain there is. There's also a theory that retrograde menstruation, because this isn't just blood, only 3 to 5 tablespoons of blood is lost every month as part of the menstrual cycle. So that's over 5 to 7 days. You're losing 3 tablespoons of blood. That's not very much. The rest is going to be sloughed off wall. And don't forget that this area, this contains a whole bunch of interesting like growth factors and things that are secreted to nurture an embryo. So there's a theory that endometriosis is linked with retrograde menstruation. So if some of that fluid ends up here, it can contain uterine tissue, which then starts growing and acting like inner endometrial tissue. So it would bleed, it necroses, and it causes a huge amount of pain. That also forms scar tissue. So remember, if the egg is fertilized up here and there's scar tissue that forms, that can block the transit of things, either because it is pinched that way, but more commonly you see things called adhesions, where scar tissue connects either the fallopian tube to the wall or to the uterus itself. And then you block or kink the transit pathway for eggs. So that's fun, right? So fluid can go out. So it's recommended that during menses, women don't go upside down, like here's you on your head, like look at me, I'm doing a headstand. And then the blood is like, hooray, I'm gonna go here and cause hell. It's also recommended that if somebody truly wants to become pregnant and they know that they have ovulated and they've had intercourse or not had intercourse and they're waiting for that, remember it takes a couple days for that egg to get down there. And then if it is fertilized, it still has to make it down there. It's going to be the same size. So it's encouraged that when people truly desire a pregnancy that they don't do high impact activity after fertilization or ovulation, because in the same way menstrual fluid can move out, the egg can actually move out into the cavity. And the best case scenario would be that the egg then just is resorbed into the lymphatic system and then excreted a typical way. But there are cases then of the egg landing on other organs and then starting to develop there. That's usually not compatible with life. So if this ended up on the bladder, it's not going to survive. Last year, somebody was watching some hospital show and they said, Dr. Bernowski, I saw on the show that somebody, their egg got trapped in their intestines and it actually grew there and it survived in the intestines. And at first I'm like, that's crazy. Grey's Anatomy is a dumb show. Why did they say that? I'm pretty sure it was Grey's. And then I looked it up, and surprise to me, there has been 3 successful pregnancies carried to term where the egg left the fallopian tube, and because of the really high blood flow and the splanchnic circulation, it actually grew there. How fun. What that means to me is not only does that sound like it kind of sucks, but hey, if that's possible, why don't men carry fetuses too? Now we have a way. So thanks science, thanks student and TV. Whew. All right, we're getting towards the end, guys. I'm going to stop putting excess information in. I love talking about this stuff, as you can tell. Okay, so we've already gone over all this stuff, so you should know that now. If there is fertilization of an egg, I mentioned it's usually up in this ampullary juncture. The process by which that egg starts to develop has a fun name. It is called cleavage. And what makes cleavage different than other types of cell divisions is that here's a zygote, there's the sperm breaking down the zona pellucida layer, one sperm gets in, calcium rushes in, shuts it down, no other sperm come in, and then this egg will start dividing. And the first division, and it's really mitosis because we're not splitting genetic material, this cell is splitting, it's cleaving into 2. But remember, this fallopian tube is really, really thin, and this transit pathway, there's not a lot of wiggle room. So when this egg splits, it can't become bigger, because if it did, it's going to get stuck, right? So when these divisions happen in cleavage, the cells split, but the body stays the same size. Isn't that cool? Yeah, Dr. B, that's super cool. Oh, good. I'm glad you think so. So here we have this cleavage process occurring until we have a final blastocyst. Blast means immature, whenever you see blasto. A blastocyst is an immature grouping of cells. It's about 32 divisions later, and that's what can burrow and embed itself into the wall, a mature blastocyst. 1/3 of the time. That is why in IVF, when females are being implanted with eggs that have started the division process, it's usually recommended that they have 3 eggs that are fertilized implanted in the uterus because of your chances 1 out of 3. That also means that it is possible to have multiple pregnancies because all of these can develop, or 2. But ideally 1. 3 is usually enough. People that put more than 3 in, those they usually use or lose their license. Like in Octomom, there were 8 put in. She had 8 kids. Yeah, they're not supposed to do that. That's not ethically correct in medicine. So that's the cleavage process. So in order for this to survive, so first of all, when this egg burrows in, when the blastocyst burrows, it makes HCG, which rescues this corpus luteum so it stays around and keeps making progesterone. Otherwise, it would just die away. And this blastocyst, the corpus luteum, then is going to stay around for the time when this blastocyst develops into an embryo. Do you remember how long I said it's an embryo for? Is it 9 months? No, it's 10 weeks. Once there has been enough development, after 10 weeks, it is now a fetus, and it now has a really big placenta. After 10 weeks, the placenta will make the progesterone. And remember, I said the progesterone is the shut off. If there's no progesterone, that means the woman can have this whole cascade happen again, ovulate from the other ovary, and then become pregnant, well, already pregnant. Isn't that great? It happens. There's also cases of people having a septum in their uterus, which isn't a normal structure, but does occur. So it would be separated into two. And sometimes women get pregnant on both sides of their uterus. How fun. I would be very unhappy, to say the least. All right, so that's implantation. The corpus luteum, and it gets really big. So actually, when they confirm pregnancy, the side that there was ovulation from is really, really big, like 3 to 5 centimeters, and the other one would be really small. So that would confirm ovulation in most cases and confirm implantation. Okay, so here's the different pieces of the uterus. I've mentioned again and again, fundus is the top, furthest away from the opening. It is a dome-shaped top. Here's the corpus, or the body of the uterus, and then the doorway, the cervix, and then that is associated with the vaginal outlet, the vaginal canal. The uterus's job, this looks like an owl in there. That's beautiful. All right, it does a couple of things. It helps move sperm up to the fallopian tubes. It provides a site for the blastocyst to implant. It limits invasion of the embryo. So what does that mean? In cancer, invasion means that it's gone from one tissue type to another. So here's the endometrium, and underneath that's the myometrium. You wouldn't want the fetus growing in the myometrium. That would be really, really awful, and it probably wouldn't survive there. So it limits that by having these nice structures in place so that it implants in the endometrium. It provides the maternal side of the placenta. The placenta is part of this process of implantation. So the placenta would grow here. You cannot move it. Wherever it starts growing is where it is. And then eventually the placenta becomes really, really big. And the reason why after delivery people bleed a lot is because that placenta, which was now like a part of the uterus, that is removed. So that comes off, and then that's the second delivery that everyone likes to forget about. So you've got this giant piece of the uterus open and bleeding. So that's after vaginal birth or C-section. All women bleed heavily after birth, and it's because the placenta peels off and now it's an open wound. That's a really great way to get an infection if intercourse happens too soon after that. That's also, even though most pregnancies are totally uncomplicated and healthy, why it's recommended that women still give birth near or in a hospital, because if bleeding is uncontrolled, when that happens, you lose about 1/3 of your blood supply in just a couple of minutes, which leads to death. And it's, if you watch Game of Thrones, you might know that Ned Stark has a secret. He took a child and raised it as his own from his sister Lyanna, who was in the Tower of Joy with a Targaryen, and that's all I'll say. But she died after birth because she didn't have anyone there to control her bleeding. And then, you know, King Robert killed all the Targaryens anyways, and he was awful. But I digress. April 14th, new season. Can't wait. It grows with the fetus. There's Rugi, and then all this muscle helps to expel the fetus. If there is no fetus in there and it's just going to slough the wall off, then it contracts to expel the menstrual fluid. Okay, the uterus has its own cycle. It's not the ovarian cycle. It is part of the menstrual cycle. So you'll still see these words follicular, luteal. So this still is going to begin in the onset of menses, day 0. And this is all about the building up, remember, of the uterine wall. It's going to get really, really big, and then it's going to slough off. So the follicular phase in the ovary, when the follicles are growing and estrogen is really high, that is referred to as the proliferative phase. Proliferate means to grow and spread. This is a process of hyperplasia, which means excessive. Plasia is substance. So excessive substance, kind of like a callus. So there's more cells, not bigger cells. Hypertrophy is bigger cells. Hyperplasia is more cells. So these cells are going to make copies of themselves through hyperplasia, so they're going to grow and spread, so that's called proliferation. So we call that the proliferative phase. Here's ovulation, nothing's happening. And then after ovulation, we know the ovary, that's the luteal phase, where the corpus luteum is around making progesterone, PRG. In the uterus, that's called the secretory phase, because now we have this really nice thick wall, and it's going to secrete a lot of fluid and a lot of things to help guide a fertilized egg there and encourage it to burrow and implant. So approximately 14 days of secretory and 14 days for proliferative. To help you remember uterine cycle, I like to use the mnemonic PMS, which usually is premenstrual syndrome, which refers to cramping and breast tenderness and things like that. And it's premenstrual because it happens before menstruation and disappears with menstruation. So P is for proliferative, M is for menstrual, and S is for secretory. So uterine cycle, proliferative, secretory, menstrual, PMS. All right, finally, we've got the cervix. We already felt our noses, so we know what it should feel like. And the cervix, when viewed through a speculum, looks kind of like a little donut with no real opening. There is a small opening, and it only really opens a lot during ovulation, and then it opens a ton during delivery. So there is an innermost area, the endocervix, there's an exocervix on the outside, and then this little piece in here is called the os. So there's an internal and external os. And you can see that here, internal os, external os, uterine cavity, endocervical canal. So the cervix makes mucus, and that's one of the most important things that it does, promise. We already know that it supports the weight of the fetus, and then as soon as it starts to dilate, that means delivery will happen. If the cervix starts to dilate too soon, that's when people are brought to the hospital. They're put on bed rest usually, and they're given a drip to inhibit premature labor. There's also times when the cervix is sewn shut. So you can see that with a pregnancy that's progressing in a way that the body keeps trying to deliver, but more commonly you see that after surgery for, I promise I wouldn't say extra things, but this is important. So let's say somebody had an abnormal pap smear and it turns out they have cervical cancer or a precancerous lesion. The way that they treat that is to cut out the area surrounding the lesion. So they want to get rid of the little tumor, and then they're going to cut out the surrounding area to make sure they got all the bad cells. But now you're missing a big part of the cervix. So if you didn't do anything and that woman got pregnant, there's not enough cervix there to support the weight of the fetus as it grows. So that means the cervix will dilate. So what they do is they sew up the cervix so that during pregnancy, the fetus, and they should be upside down, won't put pressure here and then cause the cervix to dilate, which would mean contraction's going to start because of the oxytocin storm. Remember, that's positive feedback. Fetal head pressure on cervix equals more oxytocin release, stronger contractions. So you'd have to stop that. So how does this go away? Everything is cooked at 37 weeks. So usually they let pregnancies go for 40 weeks, which is 10 months. Don't let anyone tell you 9. 10 months. That's almost a year of your life with a parasite in your body, sucking up your joy and nutrients. But anyways, but you love them. They're amazing. I love my kids. They're the best. Okay, so at 37 weeks, everything is developed, and it would be considered a term birth at that time. So when that occurs, the physician cuts the stitches. And guess what happens almost immediately after, in the next couple of days? The cervix starts to dilate. So for people who've had that procedure done, it's really, really predictable when they're going to go into labor. That's fun, right? So it's important that the cervix be there to support it. And if it keeps dilating, then you're going to deliver. And if it's too early, they will inhibit it. You try your very best to wait to 37 weeks. All right. The other thing that the cervix does is make mucus, which is really, really important. So when LH is released, 3 things happen. We already know the first one. We know that it's ovulation. It drives the egg to be released. Ovulation. The second thing that happens is that it changes the pH. So typically, I keep saying typically, I'm making myself crazy. The vaginal canal and the uterine canal, the uterine lining, the whole environment is very, very acidic. So when LH is released, it raises the pH so that if sperm made it up here, I'll draw a sperm next to this baby, sorry fetus, then it can survive and it won't be degraded by the acidic environment. The third thing that it does is thin the cervical mucus. You saw that in the video. Usually throughout the menstrual cycle, before ovulation, the cervix is making a really, really thick mucus. That is important. All right, I'm going to delete what I just drew because there's too much stuff on there. All right, that is important because that layer of mucus, this barrier, is so thick that sperm can't make it through there. Remember when I talked about progesterone-only birth controls? That's the only thing that they do. That Nexplanon or those mini pills, they just make the mucus really thick so that sperm can't get through. They just can't penetrate that barrier. During ovulation, when LH is around, it thins the cervical mucus so that it becomes an egg white consistency. Egg whites, egg white. So it can be stretched between 2 fingers, and that is the right pH and the right consistency once it thins so that sperm, that's a really long flagellum, can actually make it in there. So it's really important that that happen, and it's such an important thing that birth control pills, that when they're progesterone only, that is how they keep you from getting pregnant. Cervical mucus is really important. Whenever it thins, sperm has the ability to get through there. But you need LH to make this less acidic. You need to raise the pH. Okay, then after ovulation, the mucus goes back to being really, really thick. It's more of like a creamy type of, I know I show this in Farm, you'll love it. It becomes creamy after ovulation. So first it's really thick and mucousy, and after ovulation it's creamy and thick. So before or during ovulation, it's egg white consistency. Why did I even write those words, thick and creamy? Not just to bother you, but a sign of, are you listening? Because this is important. A sign of ovarian cancer is thick, creamy white discharge during the menstrual cycle, after the age of 45. If a woman is not ovulating, why would there be the presence of thick, creamy mucus? Well, there shouldn't be. So when you see that, I don't just want to gross you out with the words, but that's a symptom of ovarian cancer. And there's not a really good early sign for it besides that. So just keep that in mind. Any changes to things that are released, any kind of fluids in consistency or color, you always want to encourage people to get that checked out because that can be a really early sign of something that you can treat. Okay, the mucosal linings, we've got the ectocervix on the outside. That is the part that is usually affected by things like human papillomavirus, HPV, or other types of disorders because it's right next to where the irritants would be. There's the endocervix, the innermost mucosal area, and then there is the os. So there's an external os and an internal os, which are just like little pinchy points essentially to help keep both of these openings closed. So there's a little bit of opening here in the canal, but these os sections are where they pinch shut. Okay, so I mentioned that we have changes to the fluid. So this is that. So before ovulation, the cervix is low. It is it's tilted to prevent, like literally with gravity, semen from getting up and in there. It's firm, it's dry, it's just making a thick, not a really large amount of mucus, just a really thick one. At ovulation, the cervix actually rises. It opens, so you can see an actual opening through a speculum, or women can feel it, and it's soft like the tip of your nose. It becomes squishier, and it's very wet because there is a really large amount of thin alkaline mucus being made during this time. That also is associated with what behavioral psychologists would call an increased libido during ovulation, because increases in secretions is usually associated with sexual excitation. So there's a huge increase in fluid being produced, which can be perceived by the very basic brain as sexual drive. So that helps encourage intercourse during that time. After ovulation, it moves back down, it closes again, and it's a creamy, thick type of discharge. So the cervix changes a lot. Then finally, there's the vaginal canal, which is rugated. Again, it becomes very long during sexual excitation. It's copulatory. It's also the birth canal. It's non-glaborious, which means there's no hair on it. It's non-keratinized, but it's stratified squamous epithelium. So the actual vaginal canal, there's not hair inside of it. It's just smooth tissue. The pudendal is a low sacral nerve, and that provides a lot of the innervation. The vaginal canal itself actually doesn't have any glands in it. Instead, the cervical mucus provides a lot of the lubrication to the inner canals. Transudate, trans means across. Exudate is fluid formed via inflammation. When blood rushes down to the genitals, it's going to stretch the capillaries, and then the capillaries, they're one cell thick, and they're going to start widening, and then fluid can leave those spaces. So that's called exudate. Trans is when fluid just goes over a membrane or across the membrane, and it's clear because it's been pushed over that membrane and through that membrane. So exudate is usually yellow, and it's filled with a bunch of stuff. If you've ever popped a blister before, it's like yellowish, that's exudate. Clear, like pure clear fluid, is transudate. That would go through like your pleura or through a blood vessel or some sort of thing. So a lot of it's just transudate. So extra fluid from the plasma that occurs due to blood pressure changes when blood flow increases. Then there's also vestibular glands is the anatomical name. Of course, somebody named them after themselves. It was a him. He named it. They're called Bartholin's glands. Bartholin's glands are at the bottom of the vaginal vestibule, and they're exocrine glands that are making just a slight mucousy product. They empty out into the vestibule region. If you want to really become disturbed or disturb somebody else, you can Google pictures of Bartholin gland cysts, because there's a duct here. If there's anything that blocks that duct, this becomes really, really big and inflamed. But that helps keep this outside lubricated. And then the rest is just transudate during sexual excitation, and then cervical mucus. All right, the clitoris is up here. There is a hood of tissue over the clitoris that is considered an accessory organ. So unlike the male body, female orgasm is not necessary for implantation and pregnancy to occur. However, it does increase the chances of implantation. So if a female orgasms during intercourse, the females don't ejaculate. If you've ever seen that on a video, females don't do that. There was a paper put out. It's been like 5 years now. It ruined all my freshmen's life when I gave it to them. And the title of it was Female Ejaculation, It's Just Urine. Turns out that when blood flow increases to the lower sacral regions, when the blood flow goes up, that also means that the glomerular filtration rate goes up, which is the pressure of stuff being filtered or causing filtration by the kidneys. So it makes urine form more quickly. So just so you know, there is no female ejaculation. That's just pee. It's just urine. They did some studies with an MRI, and they monitored the bladder contents, and then when it emptied, and yeah, sorry to let you know, it's just urine. However, there is an opposing response to male ejaculation in females, and it is the reflex contraction of the vagina. Reflex contraction. Sometimes people will call this the upsuck, which is a fun name. But in an orgasm, not only does the uterus contract, but the vaginal wall contracts. And if you think about somebody, that woman's got really big hips. Da, da, da. So if you're upright, if this female was upright, then if there was insemination, the semen would just come out. Even though there's coagulase in it, it still would have to remain there for enough time for the coagulase to be activated. Animals have really high levels of coagulase, so they form things called sperm plugs, which are hard and actually block the vaginal canal. When I was in graduate school, I'd have to go to the breeding lab every morning, and I would have to check for sperm plugs to be sure I had read my rat vaginal swab correctly. If you think your life is bad, it's not. Okay, that's the end of that story. So when there is female orgasm, the vaginal wall contracts, the uterine wall contracts, so that creates a vacuum effect. And that brings then the semen up into the uterus, making it more likely that there would be a successful fertilization. Isn't that fun? So one way to encourage your patients having difficulty getting pregnant, try to incorporate a female orgasm into that as well as the male orgasm, and chances physiologically do become higher. Okay, and then that's it. So this is just the external genitalia, all of these things we've mentioned a couple of times. I might ask you some questions about which thing is analogous to the scrotum. Not a lot. One final thing, the perineum. Please don't mix up the peritoneum, which is in your abdomen, with the perineum, which is in between external genitalia and the anus. So this is a female perineum. You might hear people talking about getting an episiotomy. What is an episiotomy? If this female was giving birth and the infant or fetus wasn't coming out, something that OBGYNs do is make a cut. So they would make a cut here to enlarge the opening, making delivery easier. So there is a small cut, and then the female naturally tears after that. It's kind of like starting a cut. So there's small ones, but usually they're off to the side like this. They're not that long, hopefully, but here, they shouldn't be that long. Let me draw a normal size one. So they're off to the side like this. And then the female, when the crowning occurs, because the head is the biggest part, and then the shoulders kind of spin around the other way, then this would tear depending upon how much effort was put in by the female, what position she's in, and then the size of the fetal head. If it's a small tear, like just here to here, that's called a first degree tear. So that's just picks with just one superficial layer of stitches. Second layer tear is going back a little bit more, and there's deeper layers involved. Third degree tear is almost to the anus, and that involves skin, muscle, and connective tissue. A total fourth degree tear is when all of the tissue tears from the vaginal opening to the anus. Not only is that going to involve a very, very complicated correction, but there'll also have to be pelvic reconstruction after that. For any of you interested in pelvic therapy, it is recommended, and it's going through the channels now, that all females have pelvic therapy after delivery to prevent troubles with this area as it heals. If everything isn't put back into place and strengthened correctly, then the only way they treat that is by you doing a bladder sling to hold the bladder up in place. They tie it to the ischiums, so they put a little sling around it and then suture the sling to the tops of the hip bones, or they do a total hysterectomy and take everything out and hope for the best. So pelvic floor therapy, how fun. Well, I hope you learned a lot. There is so much to learn about reproductive systems in males and females, And I really hope you can answer this question: which cycle phase, endometrial cycle, is associated with the release of progesterone? So don't answer quickly. So here we're endometrial. So I just want you to remember endometrium, right? That's different than the ovaries. So that has these three letters: PMS, proliferative, secretory, and menses, right? So those are our three stages. When we're thinking about the follicular cycle, we know estrogen's really high at the beginning, and then progesterone is really high during the luteal, okay? So which endometrial cycle phase is associated with the release of progesterone? So first of all, that would be the luteal phase of, right, the ovarian cycle. So that's when progesterone is around. So now we have to find the endometrial phase, okay? So is it menstrual? No. Is it ovulatory, right here in the middle? No. Is it secretory or proliferative? So remember, to proliferate, if we draw what's going on with the uterine lining, so that means it's growing and spreading. And then the secretory phase, when the cells are really active and secreting stuff to attract eggs and things there, that is your secretory phase. So your correct answer is secretory. Very good. All right, everybody, enjoy.